going. And I have got some slides as well, so if anyone wants access to the slides afterwards as well, just let me know. So just really to introduce myself to begin with, I'm Natalie. I'm doing my PhD at the moment at University of Bath. My focus is on food waste prevention in the hospitality industry. And so just kind of a little bit of background about me as well, like, so you can see where I'm kind of coming from. I've been working in the hospitality industry sort of since leaving school, kind of unconventional route to education. And I did hospitality management, and then I did my master's in sustainability, because I had got to this point working in the hospitality industry when suddenly food waste was this, it just became really, really visible to me. And it seems like a really, really sudden thing now when I'm thinking about it. But obviously it would have been building up over time. So I just had this sudden awareness for it, and I kind of really wanted to make an active difference in actually preventing food waste, you know, for a start through reducing food waste at work in my job. And I was also doing some volunteer work at a community kitchen that ran off the model for like the Real Junk Food project, which uses surplus food from supermarkets and so on to actually make meals, and then people come along and pay, kind of pay what they feel for the meal. And then I also took part in one of my local councils at the time, waste prevention programs as a volunteer as well, particularly focused on composting. And then over time I've gradually come to do my PhD, so I can actually do research that will make an impact in the hospitality industry in particular, but also just food waste as a whole, and even just food sustainability. Because one thing about food waste is it's so hard to talk about it without talking about other aspects of waste or food sustainability and sustainability as a whole. So that's where I'm at the moment. And to start with, I wanted to ask you, really, you can put it in the chat or you can shout out, like, what's your perception of food waste? How would you define food waste? Has anyone got a kind of a picture in their head of what they think food waste is? I think it's one of those things where, you know, you can take quite a literal definition to it really and think about it, you know, well, it's the food that we throw away and things, but actually when you come to think about it, when you come to tackle it, you almost want a bit more of a defined idea of what it is. So I'm just going to share with you my PowerPoint slides now. So one of the things I've been asking in my research is this question, like, what is food waste and what does food waste mean to people? Sorry, I've ended up. I always have to make sure I'm on the slideshow bit first, otherwise I can't access it. My audios are turned off. You can't unmute yourselves. Oh, you've managed it.
I tried to respond to your question, but the mic was turned off and I couldn't get it to turn back on. And I don't know if Guy and Corey are in the same position, but mine's working now.
It's working now.
Do you want an answer, or do you want to carry on?
If you've got an opinion, if you've got a thought that you want to share with us, then go ahead. I'd like to hear.
Well, I think food waste actually begins at the growing and production stage, and it carries on right the way through. And in the hospitality situation, we are focusing mainly on what's happening within the industry itself. So some of the earlier aspects of food waste might be excluded from that, but it's food that's wasted in preparation, from the raw materials right the way to what goes on the plate, and then there's also plate waste. So it actually covers quite a broad spectrum, and some of these things are more intervenable than others because, for example, crop problems can actually be quite difficult to deal with, where we get blights and things like that. There are things that farmers do to try to prevent that, but that's a difficult one. But there are lots of areas where we can reduce the waste. But, you know, then you have to think about other things as well, like do we want to use pesticides? Do we want other control measures like that? And then further down the line, encouraging people who prepare food and people who eat food, the consumers, to waste as little as possible.
Absolutely, thank you. And Lucy commented in the chat as well. I think part of it is endless consumer choice, which means inevitable waste. So thank you both for sharing your comments there, and I'm just going to get onto the screen sharing again. So some of the things that were coming out of my research kind of encompass that whole idea that it, you know, the sort of the magnitude of the problem, and it's not, you know, simply the food that we're scraping off our plates at the end of the day. You know, it is much bigger than that. Like even thinking beyond the food itself, you know, thinking about the packaging waste, the cost of the labour to actually make it and the time spent making it, even things like overeating and problems of obesity and things like that, where we're eating more than, you know, than what our daily limit is. I mean, I know after all you're a nutritionist, so you probably could explain a bit more about that sort of thing than I can, but
Yeah.
It's, you know, it's not so simple as just the things that we scrape off our plate necessarily. But then at the same time, it's also, I feel like when you're first stepping out to tackle food waste from an individual point of view, it's quite important to actually know where you're coming from with that, and to kind of say, well, this is acceptable to me and this is not acceptable to me. So I think for me, when we think about what is food waste, it's also thinking about what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, what we class as avoidable and what we think of as unavoidable, and things like that. And there's some of the sort of things that I've been finding in my research as well. But I still haven't actually got onto the slideshow of this. So some of the definitions that are out there, like the one that's most commonly thrown around is the Food and Agriculture Organization one, which is any food that's fit for human consumption that goes to waste. And the FAO actually split their definition of food wastage into food waste at the consumption end of the supply chain, and then food loss, that's the farm agricultural stage of it. And part of why they do that is because they do counter different problems, and there's different ways of dealing with them, and there's also a slightly different perception of what that food waste is as well, because food lost during farming is not as easy to control as things through the consumption stage of the cycle. But generally, I mean, the FAO definition of they've kind of altered it over time actually, and they're focusing more on this SOFI definition about decreasing in quantity and quality of food resulting from the decisions and actions of retailers, food services and consumers. So it places that responsibility on food waste reduction and the generation of food waste, so that it's the responsibility of retailers and food service providers and consumers and everyone that's involved. It's the responsibility to actually try and prevent it, and to be just more conscious in what we're doing and things like that. So it's a really hard thing to measure. Like, it's impossible to get an accurate idea of how much food waste there is. So between 30 and 50% of food produced for human consumption goes to waste. And I think even though we've not got a precise idea of how much it is, that just goes to show that it is huge. It is huge, but the importance in actually being able to measure it precisely is so that we can tackle it more efficiently, and so that companies and governments can place benchmarks and actually kind of show their progress in preventing it and reducing it. if we look at some of the UK statistics from WRAP, which if anyone hasn't come across them, is the Waste Resource and Action Programme, and they do a lot of work about food waste and other sustainable issues. You know, they've got here some ideas of like the amount of food that's wasted in the UK. It's the equivalent of like 8 Wembley stadiums, for example. You know, it just shows like such a huge amount that is. And then in this, in terms of the food items wasted, bread, potatoes, milk, and it's very similar as well in the hospitality industry as well. You know, it tends to be the sort of the starchy, low cost filling foods that are the ones that are most wasted. So one of the comments in the chat about like making it about it being the environmental issue as well. This actually thinks about some of the impacts of food waste here. So the UN Sustainable Development Goal 12.3 is to reduce global food waste by half by 2030. And the reason that food waste is such a big issue is because it has got such a broad stream of issues, environmentally, socially, and economically. So one of the things that you might have heard before is that food waste as a country, it would be the third biggest greenhouse gas emitter after the US and China. And I think one of the things with food waste, that there's this common misconception that if food waste is sent to landfill, it doesn't matter because food waste is biodegradable. But the problem there is that actually food waste doesn't biodegrade in landfill because of the way landfill works. So it then releases methane, and it has groundwater issues and all this sort of thing that lead to various other environmental problems. But then equally, there's the environmental problems that have happened when the food was actually produced. So the land use, the water use, the transport to get it to places, and this is food that then ends up not being eaten. So there's like this cost that, you know, could have been avoided. As well, the social issues, so things like food security, because producing more food than we need is going to drive up the cost, and then it will make it even more inaccessible for people that can't access food even at the moment, and people that struggle to. So a lot of the data is quite old, and I think that's partly because it is so difficult to measure. But so according to the 2013 data, food produced for human consumption is enough to feed 2.5 times the population, which at the time, when this was written, I think the argument was by 2050, the amount of food produced would only just be enough to feed the population in 2050. And so this illustrates how the how that kind of supply and demand of food is not actually on the right place, and it is a systemic problem because the food's not ending up where it needs to be. And in the case of almost half of it, it's actually ending up going in the bin. And of course, you know, particularly thinking from an individual point of view, if it's going to be, if it's motivation for just individuals to help prevent food waste, is actually in the UK, the average household could save £60 a month by reducing food waste. And I think when I look at some of the household statistics at the moment, I just find them so hard to believe, actually. And I think it's because I've been doing this for so long and being so aware for so long, and have been hardly producing any food waste myself. I just find it incredible the amount that people do waste. And it's not all through the fault of us as individuals. Like, everybody's got a role to play, and you know, we're influenced by supermarkets and retailers and being sold too much. And yeah, like I said, because it's a systemic problem, you know, you can't, everybody's got to get involved. Everybody's got to do something to actually help prevent it, and you know, maybe somehow to change the system, at least into a way that's more effective. So I couldn't actually find the image I was looking for this one. There is a infographic out there which shows the pre-farm gate statistics as well. So this is just post-farm gate information, which shows this household waste of 70%, hospitality and food service 12%, manufacture 16%, and then retail 3%. But what this doesn't show is that there's kind of this transference of waste as well. So although, say, the one good example really is retail is 3%, and that's how much they throw away. Manufacturers throw away waste that's associated with supermarkets, for example, through cancelled orders. And it's the same with, say, the, if anyone can remember watching the food waste programs that Youth Early Mission still did, they had these massive piles of parsnips on farms and things that were going to waste, and food like that that's been cancelled through orders with supermarkets and things like that isn't actually attributed within that sector's waste, and yet they could have a particular bearing on actually making a difference with waste elsewhere. And so I think that just kind of illustrates how everything's connected, and to actually influence how you're preventing waste at one point, you can actually influence it further down the chain as well. Sorry, I'm just reading the comments. So in hospitality, food waste has a direct effect on a unit's profitability. However, as hospitality is made up of thousands of operators, they have other pressures, especially this year, so they have not concentrated on it. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's, when I talk about my research in a little bit, then hopefully that's something that will come across in that I can talk a little bit more about then. So these are just some of the statistics relating to food waste in hospitality, which is the equivalent of 1 in 6 meals, at least when this data was achieved. No, it is really difficult to get to get some reliable data for hospitality and food service waste, just because there's so many different aspects to it, and it's such a complex industry. And there's no, I mean, I know from my own experience working in different kitchens, is that there can be sometimes it's very easy to record all the waste, and in other times it's not, maybe because the forms aren't necessarily set out right, or the staff aren't interested in or understanding why it's important, or they're too busy, and there's so many different factors. And one of the things in my research is that I've got I found that the different perspectives that people had of food waste captured this quite nicely. Is that someone who worked front of house was seeing food waste in a very consumer plane oriented way. So it's the food that was scraped off people's plates, which in a lot of cases is not waste that's recorded. Whereas a cafe manager I spoke to viewed food waste more in terms of the things that she writes down on her wastage sheet. So it's all the things that things like the sandwiches that didn't sell and things like that. So both these different ways, they kind of don't meet in the middle. So it's really difficult to capture that whole of what's wasted. So thinking about hospitality in particular, there's voluntary and legal requirements to reduce waste. So RAP runs various campaigns, and some of these are retail focused as well, so not just hospitality. But they're just they've got lots and lots of information, reports, guidelines and all sorts on their website. I mean, it's a massive source of information and data to help businesses actually look at their waste, see where they can make differences, and put actions into process as well, and also provide a bit of a community as well. For example, for the Guardians of Grub, it's providing this kind of community to actually discuss with each other what can be done and where improvements can be made. So for anyone that hasn't come across this food waste hierarchy, which it's very similar really to sort of the 3 R's when we think about reducing, reusing, recycling, but it's very much tailored to food waste in the food industry. And of course, you know, you want to start at the top. You want to focus as much effort as you can on preventing the food waste and then reducing it where possible, and making sure that it goes, if you can't sell it, then making sure it goes to people, following down that to animals and so on. And then this middle section, you're then looking at recycling and recovery so that you can at least get some sort of value out of it. You know, even if it's not eating it, then it's got the value of energy, fertilizer to grow more plants and things like that. And ideally, we should be getting down to the red bit at the bottom, and there should be nothing there. But you know, the way the system works, that's not necessarily the case. But it's certainly, you know, it's a good guideline really to actually try and show the sort of what's most important to think about first. But then in the same way, you should also be thinking about it all at the same time. Because there's always going to be things you can't do anything with. You could, you know, even if you trim down portion sizes, doesn't necessarily mean that everybody's going to eat everything on their plate. So you're always going to have these certain aspects of food that do need to have a direction of disposal that isn't landfill, for example. But for the things that you can actually control, having a look at these different prevention methods and trying to minimise that. The best policy is to appoint a member of staff to be in charge for a week or two, measure all food waste by placing in separate bins and weighing the individual bins and recording the results, then engaging with staff on ways to reduce it. If staff aren't engaged in the process, it won't reduce. Absolutely. So so this leads on nicely to where I'm kind of at with my research, actually, you know, thinking about engagement of staff and kind of the receptiveness of them and how willing they are to actually carry out the practices that are being introduced. So I'm doing my research through a series of interviews, and I've just completed the first stage. And I'm thinking kind of about like how we talk about food waste and sustainability. And this is kind of within the actual hospitality environment, but then also extending out to consumers, suppliers, and so on. And so I'm talking to people that work in the hospitality industry about their perceptions of food waste and how they deal with it and how they communicate about it to other members of staff and then to customers and anyone else they might have dealings with. And so this is me trying to visualize my thoughts at the moment. So I'll explain it a little bit to you. So I'm thinking about that process of talking about a new food waste practice or trying to get someone to understand your point of view about food waste and what you could do about it. And so the person at the beginning of this chain, it could be the manager, it could be the employee. And so what I'm finding in my research is that person there that's conveying this message, they've got to have some sort of sense of expertise, be passionate, be consistent in what they're actually saying, and also be really positive and hopeful about it. And I think that's particularly coming out at the moment because of the climate and everything that's going on. I feel like there's there's this need for people to be really, really positive and hopeful about what they're actually trying to achieve. And so at the other end, you've got the person they're speaking to. So that might be another employee, or it might be their manager, or it might be a customer. And again, that person's got to be receptive to what they're saying. They've also got to be asking questions as well, which is kind of showing that this is a two-way process. It's not just someone saying, this is what you've got to do. The person at the other end, if they're actually really engaged with it, have got to be asking back again, you know, yeah, but why? Or can you explain how to do this, do this again? And so that they fully understand what they're actually doing. And a big part of conveying this information is through conversations. You know, and we see this all the time in the workplace with employees and each other, employees, managers, but then also for frontline staff as well, because they have got that, you know, that daily communication with the customer and so on. But then the conveying messages also will happen, say, through training, if it's within the organisation, social media, if it's with passing on messages to consumers and things. And one of the things I'm thinking about is this kind of acoustic element of things. And because in my interviews, people use a lot of words that are kind of, you know, they don't shout about it or you've got to reiterate all the time. And they talk about sound waves and things like that. And so it's sort of elements that you need to think about in terms of the tone that is used and the frequency and the volume, and also how you actually need to adapt what you're saying, depending on the person, depending on what's going on at the same time, in the environment, in the internal environment, and also the external environment. And so, like on my diagram, the black arrows indicate noise, and so this noise could be things like COVID, things like Brexit and recessions, and things that are coming in from the outside and actually adapting how people are feeling or what people have to be done, and that sort of thing. And then equally, because this is a process, this feedback as well. So the employee is feeding back to their manager or their other employee about what they actually think they've said, and it kind of begins again. So I hope that made a bit of sense to anyone. Has anyone got anything they'd like to share, any questions on that, or anything they didn't understand? It's still a work in progress, but I just thought I'd like to share it with you today.
Yeah, I was just putting something up on the chat. Thanks very much for that. Yeah, and it's about this issue of quantifying food waste. But although it's relatively easy, provided, of course, you get people to engage, and that's the first thing. And often when they're busy, it's difficult to get them to do that. And I do understand that problem. But if you've got it set up, it's quite difficult to get any differentiated information about different types of foods that are being wasted. Okay, people might be able to comment and say, oh, well, we're getting more waste of one type than another or something like that, but to actually get the quantities is quite difficult. And I just wondered if anybody had any ideas or practice of doing that. So, you know, you're not just looking at total waste, but you're looking at which things are being wasted most and trying to get some quantity on it if possible. Do you follow what I mean? Yeah.
I mean, from my experience,
in practice.
Yeah, I think from my experience, it's definitely been very difficult in practice. And I've had different experiences in different places. And I think it depends mostly on the complexity of the operation. If it's something that the places I've worked, if it's very simple, where they're just selling sandwiches or pasties or something like that, it's very easy to quantify and say it was one of this and one of this and one of this or whatever. Whereas places where you know, I've worked on sort of hot food counters where you and that's the most challenging, because sometimes it's really hard to work out, at least in a quick way, how many portions you've got of something. Because I think the time element is the biggest issue. But then also it's the little things, isn't it? The things like the things that you don't do for quality control, like trimming off the ends of the tomatoes and stuff like that, the bread crusts. You know, I remember not using bread crusts for sandwiches, and you'd put them in a pile, and you go, well, that's a whole loaf of bread just there, just in bread crusts. And that's often things that don't get counted.
Yeah. And I can understand that it might not be quite as important in some settings as in others, but I mean, I've been particularly looking at this within the nursing home that I'm involved with, where we've got the same people all the time. So you're expected to, you know, really see a bit of a pattern to this. And we have, you know, we've got round it by collecting the waste and then getting comments back from the staff that have been collecting it to say, what do you think's being wasted most? But we haven't really quantified it. And then you've got to try and think, you know, well, how can you change that? What would work better? And so on. Anyway, thank you.
No problem.
I'm still looking into that, you know, trying to find better methods of measuring food waste.
Yeah, and I think that's always the challenge. I mean, I think from an academic perspective, about half the research in hospitality food waste is trying to find a way of measuring food waste.
Stop, yeah, just the total.
And it's just, you know, just looking at some of the ideas that they've got, everyone's still a bit stuck over it, I think. And I think there's, to some extent, it's, you know, there's a certain element of things where you can sort of rely on that skill and experience, and just monitoring the waste in a not so formal way, you know, just by saying, there's always a bit too much potato coming back, so we'll just cut down on that a little bit. But then
that's common.
in a bigger operation, then that's a lot harder to do, and do need to kind of I think there's some technology systems which I think are a bit more helpful for measuring things, and they do help. But then I also know people that just rely on doing it manually and much prefer doing that. So thinking a bit about different ways to prevent food waste, kind of at work and at home. So some of these things, you know, I think a lot of the core ideas cross over from a hospitality provider, or at least a small one, and in home life. Like for me, I find that actually looking at what I'm doing at work or at home has a bearing on the other and does help. So this first one's really about sort of menu planning and design, shopping lists and buying what you need, buying little and often. I find are really helpful tactics to help prevent waste, particularly at home. In the hospitality environment, it is a lot more challenging, especially at the moment, because it's so hard to tell what demand's going to be on day after day, and not knowing, you know, there's so many uncertainties and things. Other things as well to do with cleaning and maintaining equipment and making sure that things are stored properly are obviously a really important thing. Particularly from that food safety aspect as well, making sure that food doesn't become contaminated, and then also through stock rotation, making sure that things that need using first, the things that are used first and don't get lost at the back of the fridge. And again, portion control, so sort of measuring out things, making sure that you're actually cooking the right amount of food that you need to feed the people that you are going to feed. Of course, in a hospitality environment, that's much more challenging because it relies on forecasting as well. But then, depending on how the setup is, then if you can cook little and often, then you might be able to control that a bit easier. fridge temperatures, so making sure your fridge is between 0 and 4 degrees, and if you've got a temperature. So obviously in the hospitality industry, you should have fridge temperatures and be doing temperature checks and stuff anyway, but at home it's really useful to actually get a thermometer just so that you can monitor that. And then the other thing I find really handy is actually checking recipes for those odd ingredients that you need to use up and need ideas for. So just sort of searching through online and in cookbooks and so on. Again, preserving food, making use of freezer. This is something I found quite interesting actually in my research, because it's not really been talked about in prior hospitality food waste research. Is this actually freezing food? Everyone I've spoken to has been talking about freezing things a lot more, and part of that is the impacts of COVID and not being able to predict demand as easily as they were previously, and having so many more uncertainties about whether things are going to close. But I think there's almost this change of attitude into, like, people are sort of actually thinking, well, putting the food in the freezer and then taking it out again when I need it, it's just as fresh as when I bought it anyway, especially if they portion it and do it straight away. So that's something I'm finding quite interesting, is that people's perceptions around frozen foods changed a little bit. And I think one of the important things as well is to actually address conflicts and kind of accept that sometimes you do need to make compromises because it is that systematic problem. And what I mean by that is things like when you're thinking about other sustainability issues, and whether you're using plastic and organic and local food and things like this, and that kind of combination of different things there.
Yeah, thank you. I think a lot of these things really are about good housekeeping measures, aren't they? Just, using that term very broadly. But unfortunately, the way that people live at the present time, because they're often very busy and so on, I think a lot of people take shortcuts, and the way we shop doesn't really help. Because I know you're saying here, and I agree, shop little and often, but for a lot of people, that's not very convenient. Yeah. And that, I think that's one of the main areas where the consumer does tend to go wrong these days, where they're buying too much from the supermarket quite often. And because they've got more than they can adequately store properly, perhaps at home, then inevitably some of it gets thrown away because it spoils, or it's going a bit stale, so it just goes in the bin, etc. And yeah, I agree about good use of the freezer, but again, I mean, I have come across this in some consumers, where some people, they have a freezer, but although they've stocked it up, they don't really use it enough. Yeah. So it's getting full of things they're not actually eating, and instead of eating out of the freezer, they're tending to eat fresher foods and not use the freezer very much, so it doesn't really serve its purpose. And how we actually tackle that in individuals is quite difficult. Yeah, but hopefully, I mean, the more we sort of put the message across, the more people will hopefully follow what we're trying to persuade them to do. But I mean, from my point of view as a dietitian, the plate waste is very important as well, because it doesn't matter how good the food on the plate is, if it isn't eaten, it doesn't do what it's intended to do. Or on the other hand, if there's too much on the plate or too little, that's the other problem as well that we've got.
Yeah, but in hospitality, there's a movement now to having menus where you have several sizes of the same dish, because an elder person probably won't eat the same as a 20-year-old. So
yeah, I'm aware of that, and I think that's a really good idea. It helps a lot, but it doesn't. It unfortunately doesn't solve all the problems we've got.
Well, unfortunately, Avril, there's no perfect system, so no system will totally eradicate anything it's trying to eradicate, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. But there's not all that much been written up about this. But over the years, I think there has been a tendency for people to be eating larger portions than they used to do in the past.
Yeah.
Even though in the past, people were more active because lifestyles are very different. So there are a lot more very physically active jobs than there are today. So we need to try to reverse that, really.
But is that the job of hospitality?
Well, I think everybody has to play their part. We have to all work together on this. I'm not saying it's necessarily hospitality's prime responsibility, but everybody should have some responsibility, because we should all be helping everybody to do the best they can in this situation. It's really important. We do need to work together, and it's the whole system that we need to look at. The whole food system culture really does need to change to some extent if we're going to tackle these problems. It's very complex.
Has anyone got any particular thoughts on the sort of things that we could do?
I wondered if, sorry, I've been a bit quiet. I was actually eating earlier. I had my lunch. That's all I've had to eat today. Talking of food. Let me put my camera on so I'm not so unfriendly. Yes, one thing I've thought about for a long time is so many hospitality venues you go to, and the menu is huge. It's pages and pages, and often you think a lot of this stuff is also not at all seasonal. Why am I being offered asparagus in December? I do not want asparagus in December, and it's not going to taste good either. But if the menu is so long, there's inevitably going to be waste, isn't there? But there are just too many things there, and at the end of the physical day, whatever day I'm in that place, there's going to be stuff left over. I'm always much happier when I see a smaller menu, just 4 or 5 things. We don't need endless choice, and then there's less likely to be waste. But I don't know if people agree, is that a sort of cultural change that we need? Because we're just used to seeing, whole pages of things before us.
In my experience, and to put it in context, I've got 30 years plus in hospitality. I'm a licensed trade stock auditor. I'm at National Council Institute of Licensed Trade Stock Auditors. Those venues, apart from the high end ones, the ones most of us are going to two meals, 20 quid sort of thing with long menus. Most of that will be coming out of the freezer. They're not cooking. It's Laping kitchens.
Yeah.
There is a movement to bring in, especially this year with obviously COVID and restrictions, that there is a movement to be bringing down sizes of menus so that they can be far more agile. I certainly encourage my clients to speak to their suppliers, find out what's in season. The greengrocer they use, wholesale greengrocer, he'll know what he needs to shift. He'll do deals because he wants everything. He doesn't want it. If it's going to spoil, if he doesn't shift it, it's going to spoil in his warehouse as much as it's spoiling the end user's warehouse. So they've got to start talking to their supply chain to find out what's in season, what's available, when it's coming in, and keep those menus agile.
Yeah,
as well as keeping portion size agile.
Yeah, totally agree. And another issue is a cafe in Bedford, Made in Bedford, which is really fantastic cafe and selling all local produce and really good quality food. And the menu is very small and it changes every day what they've got and obviously what's in season. But Rachel, who runs it, she said sometimes people will come in and they're very angry if they order something and Rachel say, I'm sorry, we've run out of that, can offer you this instead, or she can adapt it. And they expect those things to be there and they're not happy at all when they're not there. And I think that's something we need to adapt to and say.
It's a culture thing that has grown up with the advent of a certain restaurant chain with double arches. Everybody expects to be going in, get what's on the menu, get it in, get it almost presented to them before they walk through the door.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when they want fresh produce, we've got a great section of the population has got to be re-educated that stuff doesn't just happen in seconds, it takes time to cook.
I agree with you. And you saying, you know, if there's a big menu, it's all come out of the freezer. If there's
that's my experience. I can't be quoted on that because until some big change, it's not. But yeah, the bigger the menu, it's got to be, because especially if you go to pub restaurants, they haven't got the storage space for all that stuff to keep it fresh.
Yeah.
And they can't try and have it there defrosted, pre-done. Well, and a lot of it, some of the change, it comes in from a production kitchen.
Yeah. So I think we should be, ideally, we should be taught to be reassured if something's run out. We should go, okay, that was a fresh thing made today and it was popular and it's all gone, so I've got to choose these foods. Instead, we should enjoy that instead of being critical of staff. And
but it's also down to venues to educate their clients whether they are, you know, they're cooking from fresh, so things will run out if there's been a run on it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because the last thing a hospitality venue wants is to be allowing chefs to send out to local co-op, Tesco's or whatever, because that will totally decimate their bottom line.
Yeah.
And that will also cause wastage, because it usually means, oh, I need peas, can't find it, but in fact there's a case of peas in one of the freezers out in what used to be the stables. They can't be bothered to send a KP out there to go and get them. So it's just, you know, co-ops next door, go and get a bag of peas.
Yeah. Yeah, no, we need to educate people, don't we? Definitely.
Well, if I could recommend for people who are actually dealing with the supplies, it's useful to review. We did this at the nursing home, and it's fairly small scale, perhaps compared to what some of you are working with. But we looked at all the suppliers, and we set various criteria. We looked at price, but we also looked at quality and what was available, and whether or not you know, we could be dependent on certain suppliers and how often they delivered and how far they were coming from. And we reviewed the whole thing and we gave it a kind of star rating. And then actually we changed some of the suppliers. And it's working very well at the moment. The only problem that we had was in terms of storage space for things like fresh milk. There wasn't quite enough storage space when we were proposing some of the changes, but we managed to get around that. You know, it's actually saved money as well, so it's well worth doing. And we've got I mean, it's not perfect, but we've got a much more sort of sustainable and locally sourced supply now. And it's more reliable and it doesn't cost as much. So there are lots of benefits from doing something like that. It doesn't take all that long to do.
But the other thing from hospitality is, I think you meant, even when you've got portion control, it's when they've costed it out, like the head chef, the unit manager, the owner operators costed it out. The chef's going to have a day off, so the sous chef might take over the commis chef, number 2, or they might have a cook that takes over, unless it's specified down. Or this is where I've knocked a certain fast food chain, but you can take practices out of that industry where they've got scoops. You know, when you have your chip, your French fries, that's a scoop, and it's measured, and every unit is the same. So what a hospitality venue should have, sort of pub restaurant, which is what I mostly deal with in restaurants, is you have your menus, you have your dish specification, you have your costings and everything, but then put a picture with it so that whoever's taking over the kitchen, or if the chef has to go off shift for some reason, he's got his hand or something, whoever takes over can easily look at that recipe, and straight away it's got all the allergens in it, it's got everything that needs to be done, how it's presented on the plate, and a picture of it, so they know it's straight there. Because what usually happens, as soon as somebody else takes over, we'll pile it high, so waste is going to come back. But plus the unit is not only losing money on the extra ingredients they've used, that's food waste that they've got to pay for some waste contractor to take away.
Yeah, I would agree with the issue that you've raised there. Thank you. But I would say that, you know, it's a training need and it should come from the top down, so that even though you're going to always have some differences depending on who's cooking and serving up, you can't really eliminate those completely. You can try to minimize them, and people, you know, are aware of what is expected of them.
Yeah, but a lot. What's happening now is a lot of the training, a lot of the colleges now are getting decimated. There's not the traditional catering colleges where kitchen staff would have gone and learned their craft. So that's not infused in them. And there's a lot of operators that don't come from a catering background.
Yeah.
They're encouraged to take on the pub restaurant by one of the pub groups, and they have no training. So it's people like us that are talking to the venues and that should be educating them. So, as you're right, it's an education thing, but it's not from the management down. Sometimes the managers, the owner operators need educating as well.
Yeah, and agree. And it's a shame about the colleges, you know, being kind of broken up a bit like that. So, although I've got, you know, background in dietetics and nutrition, I've done quite a lot of work in the catering industry, and I've taught in catering colleges. I did do the first part of the chef's qualification. I didn't do the second part, I did the first part. And you know, catering was sort of part of my course anyway when I trained. So yeah, I understand where you're coming from. Thanks.
Thank you. It's a really interesting conversation. Thank you. And I think one thing that I found quite interesting in that is, you know, the lessons that we can learn from these bigger companies that do have these very specific, you know, the very specific kind of standardization for their portion sizes and things like that. Because although in one sense they're obviously creating probably more waste than smaller providers because of this lack of control, and because they've always got to have so much food for customers in case customers want something, whereas smaller businesses can just say, yeah, we've sold out, how about this instead? You know, I think you can learn, there's lessons that we can learn from both sides, and I think that's where having conversations and talking to people about this from all different backgrounds is really, really helpful. Unfortunately, I think sometimes the people that get involved in the conversations are the ones that you know, are already in that mindset and don't necessarily have the sort of level of power that's necessary to make change, perhaps if they are working for a big company or something. And I think that's one thing that's quite difficult to overcome, is you know, that kind of not preaching to the converted kind of thing.
Yeah, well, you know, this is why I feel we have to do it across the whole system, because otherwise, if it's only the converted that are doing it, it's not really going to be effective, is it? We've got to really try and get everybody engaged. And at the moment, I'm focusing quite a lot on the agricultural side, which is an area I have worked in a little bit in the past, but not very much. But I mean, it's a big learning curve, but there's a great deal of interest there. And again, there's a lot to be shared. So, you know, I think we do have to be working across the whole system. It's really important.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I actually do freelance work, so I can make up my mind what I do, really. It's, you know, there's no one telling me that I have to focus on one thing or another. And some of the work that I do on this is voluntary because I do it for my professional association.
Great. I think that's really good to actually be able to go out and do that sort of thing, and you've got that bit more of that freedom to actually talk to people in different areas as well.
Yeah, and I'm lucky because I have got a lot of experience I'm not particularly young, but I've worked in a lot of different aspects of my area of expertise, so that helps a lot, I think. I've worked, you know, quite a lot across the food industry, as well as working in hospitals, research, universities, and so on, and community dietetics as well. So, you know, it's actually quite a good mix because it brings a lot of different things together.
Yeah, brilliant. We are gone for now, but I'm sure people have probably got to get off to do other things. Has anyone got anything else they'd like to say before we finish off? I mean, has anyone got any final thoughts that they want to share?
Well, I think it would be useful to keep the conversation going.
Yeah.
I had just one question, Natalie, that you might know. What sort of proportion of hospitality venues do compost their food on site? I'm sure it's a tiny proportion, isn't it?
I imagine it's such a tiny proportion that there probably isn't even a statistic out there.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think part of that as well is because businesses over a certain size are required to actually separate their food waste and send it for anaerobic digestion anyway, whereas smaller businesses aren't. So obviously it's very much down to the business to actually sort it. I mean, again, that's something that would be quite interesting to look into, and actually encouraging smaller businesses to separate out the food waste. And
yeah, we have a good one good example in Bedford that does. They compost all of theirs, and nearby we have Biogen anaerobic digestion, which takes a lot of supermarket waste. So yeah, there is capacity there for that to happen to a greater degree, but it's a big thing, obviously.
That's another conversation to have, isn't it?
It is. It's been really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I hope it's been helpful. And it's just great to actually have a chat with people about this. And like Ava said, it'd be great to keep the conversation going and you know, have a think about what to do, and that, you know, will have an impact. And actually, I mean, you know, it's just saying about like small businesses and encouraging them to pay out food. That would be one step that is something that could be thought about. And you know, there's lots of other things we've talked about that perhaps maybe think about.
On that point, if there was a sort of collection service available, that might help, you know, so that might be something that somebody could think about setting up. For example, I spent some time in Canada as well, and I'm not sure if it's across the whole of Canada, but certainly where I was, as well as collecting what we would call a brown bin, they had smaller bins that were for composting, so food waste went into those and it was collected from every household, you know, provided they put it out, obviously. So, you know, things like that can be set up. It's something we don't do here at the moment, but, you know, maybe it's something that the government should be thinking about supporting at the local level.
Yeah, I think it varies a lot per county. I'm in Leighton Buzzard, and this last month they've started rolling it out.
Oh, they have, right.
In South Central Bedfordshire for houses. So I'm not benefiting from that one yet, but
it comes to Biogen, Natalie, in Bedford.
Yeah, I presumed it did.
Yeah, because Bedford, or some of it does at least, because Bedford, we don't have food waste collections yet, curbside, and I'm asking for it constantly. But it's ironic that Central Beds now there's
well, it's getting there.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Getting there. I mean, I just find the irony of, you know, the fact that it's rolled out to houses first, which I can completely understand because I know what waste sites are like in flats. But yeah, it's when in flats you haven't got so much access, it's a bit ironic.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Well, in businesses, I mean, it's
Definitely. I mean,
not
it is a good
easy
thing.
to
It's
dispose
just,
of waste. That's the trouble. But perhaps, you know, it could be an incentive to the hospitality sector that any food waste for composting will be collected free of charge, and that would then be an incentive for it to be used in that way. I mean, obviously, I don't make the policy, but these are just ideas.
yeah. Yeah, I think that's the thing, because it's a challenge enough getting it on households. But I suppose there's more
Yeah.
households than businesses, so perhaps on a business level it would be easier for smaller businesses. But
And I recall in Canada that some people were sort of saying, well, it's okay collecting this stuff, but it seems to attract flies, and they seem to be having more problems with flies in the summertime. Although I don't know if any of you, know much about Canada, but it does depend where you are in Canada, obviously. But the summers can be quite hot in Canada, actually. So it did seem to be a bit of a problem, but I suppose there's a downside to everything, isn't there?
okay, well, thank you everybody. I can get slides sent over to you as well, and we will have the recording available too. My email is on the slide as well if anyone wants to get in contact with any questions at all at any point. So thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you, Natalie, and good luck with your research. How long have you been doing it?
I am about 2.5 years in, so
Right.
yeah, about 1.5 years to go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
But yeah, it's at the fun bit now. It's actually talking to people and collecting data and things. So
yeah, yes, yeah. Well, yeah, I would like a copy of the slides, please, if you could forward them. Thank you. And yeah, perhaps we can, keep in touch with. I noticed, Guy, you're on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn, but I've only really just started doing that, so
I can't say
I haven't
the
got
same.
many contacts there, but it isn't that I haven't got contacts, they're just not on LinkedIn at the moment.
I'm on
But
LinkedIn.
yeah, welcome to join.
I was going to say I'm on LinkedIn, but I don't really use it, to be honest. But I'm on the committee of Bedfordshire Climate Change Forum, and I'm thinking we're doing a lot of food-themed events in the next few months. We did one last week on soil health with Kiss the Ground film. But I'm thinking what you do could be really useful, perhaps in the spring, Natalie. I don't know if you'd be interested in coming to talk to us, or even just this presentation would be great as a part of. We're doing lots of themes around agriculture, farming, growing, allotments, smallholders, permaculture, but food waste is one of the themes that we want to look at. We haven't planned that yet, but if you'd be interested, that could be great for you.
brilliant, thank you.
Great, thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right, thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Corey.
No worries.
Take care.
Bye then.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.